In this video, we're going to be talking about the extremely useful layer blend if sliders in Photoshop. Hi there, Michael Wilchinovich here from Retouching Academy. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Retouching Academy and also at retouchingacademy.com. So today we're going to be talking about a feature within Photoshop that is extremely useful, and actually a lot of people don't really know that it's there, but it's very powerful and will save you a lot of time if you know the context that it's useful in. So basically I've got two layers here that I'm going to use to demonstrate how this actually works. And the first one here is just, we've got two gradients. We've got a black to white gradient, and another one is a red that goes essentially from red to sort of a grayish red to white. And below that we have this solid blue to white gradient layer. So basically the feature that we're talking about, the blend if sliders, can be found by either right-clicking on the layer and going into blending options, or you can just double-click on the layer and that will also bring up the dialog that you want. So basically the dialog itself, the blend if sliders are found down here in this bottom portion, and you'll primarily be using blend if on gray. I mean, you can use it on any of the color channels, but you very rarely do that. Generally you're using it on the gray level. So essentially it's how much darkness within that color is found. So if you took that color and you desaturated it completely, what level of darkness or lightness do we want to apply a particular layer to? So the blend if actually breaks down into two sliders. The first one is essentially talking about the current layer, whatever layer we're applying the blend if to, and the bottom slider is fetching out the information from the underlying layer. So essentially what happens is if we start bringing these sliders over, what we're saying is clip that layer from a particular area. So if we actually start dragging it from this end here, we see that we're not applying anything from our active layer that is lighter than this area of gray, essentially this amount of gray. If we go from the dark side, essentially we're saying don't apply anything from this layer that is darker than this amount of gray. Now that's all well and good, and as you can see that we can immediately see what that's doing by looking at these two gradient layers, but it's not terribly useful to actually split your layers this way, because as you can see it creates a really rough and ugly edge over here in areas like this, and then you'll have the same problem if you're working on a real image. So for that reason, if you hold down the Option key and you actually start dragging these, you can separate them out into essentially almost like a feathered edge. So rather than creating harsh transition, it will smooth the transition between those areas. So now with Option held down and we start dragging this, we see that it's applying that gradation much more smoothly, and this is basically just serving as a cutoff point. So we can still use this in combination, but you definitely want to split the slider at least slightly in order to provide a smoother transition. Now we can do the same thing with the underlying layer. So for example, we want to let the underlying layer dictate what is going to come through. We can do the same thing here. So we can essentially use this, and now we see that anywhere where the underlying layer is darker than this amount of gray, then this top layer won't show. Similarly, if we go from the other side, again it's going to cut off anywhere where the underlying layer is lighter than this amount of gray, and all the same things apply. So for example, we can split this here and provide a smooth edged transition between them. So now this is all well and good, and you may be wondering, why is that useful? Where would you actually use that? And the most common use for this is either using things like a curves or a levels adjustment, or trying to colorize your image. So for example, if we go into a real live image over here, something like this, and we create a brand new layer here. I'm going to take this layer, I'm going to fill it with this yellowish kind of color. So I'm going to hit Option Delete, and that's going to fill with that particular color. Now we're going to change our layer to color blend mode, so essentially we actually see a portion of our underlying layer. Now let's say we want to only apply this color to the highlights of our image. So essentially it's the brightest areas. So right here the highlights within the skin, maybe the highlight in the back of the actual background, and maybe some on the knees here. So to do that, normally what we'd have to do, we'd have to create a layer mask in here and either use Apply Image to add a layer mask to that, adjust it with a levels adjustment, or use channels-based selections to build that mask. And while that's all possible, it just uses up more space, more memory, and it's a lot more time consuming than just using the blend if. So with the blend if, again, we're just going to double click our layer. And we're going to basically use the underlying layer, because obviously we don't want to use this top slider because our layer is one solid color, so we obviously don't want to use that. So essentially, again, what we're doing is we want to actually clip the shadows off, so we don't want it applying at any point in the shadow. So if we actually start dragging this, we can immediately see that it's already only starting to apply to certain areas. So again, we want to find a decent place to cut this off and then split our slider, because again, this looks absolutely awful. So now if we split it and we start dragging down, we see that quite smoothly it's applying that color to just our highlights. Now again, if we just bring down our opacity a little bit, because that's obviously very exaggerated, we can essentially see that the highlights in the skin are now more yellowish in color, but everything else in the image, barring of course the background, which was bright as well, remains unchanged. So all of the shadows and everything do not have that yellow color cast applied to them. Another situation, of course, is something like a levels adjustment. So if we went in here, or let's say I'm going to actually use curves instead of levels, but essentially they're both the same thing. So if we're going to raise this exposure up, and now we again apply a blend to that, we can clip that exposure adjustment, or curves adjustment essentially, to only areas of highlight. So again, we're going to just split that here. And once again, we see that we've now brightened our highlights, but we've left the shadows intact. We can of course do the opposite and say, okay, I only want to brighten the shadow. So I can again take this in the other direction, split it, and now we see that only our shadows are actually lighter, and again the highlights remain unchanged. So from a practical standpoint, that's where you're going to be using the blended sliders the most. Things like applying color casts and things like making adjustments selectively to either an area of shadow, midtone, or highlight within your image. So I know we covered a lot of information there, and hopefully that was useful to you. And as I said, it's an extremely useful feature within Photoshop, and it's something that once you start learning, you'll really wonder how you ever lived without it. So do some experimenting with your own images, try and apply some adjustment layers, and see how they work in the context of blend if, either from the active layer or from the underlying layer. So until next time, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel below, and also visit us at retouchingacademy.com for more written articles and tutorials.